everyone, and welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Today's episode I've entitled The Apologist. Why the title? Well, I'm talking about an apologist in the proper sense of the word, and that is someone who defends others, who comes to their aid, who takes up their cause, who defends the right. Not the apologist in the sense of our Prime Minister, who it was just announced today is about to make yet another apology on behalf of some soldiers who are long dead from World War I. The man we have today is, I would describe him, among other things, as an apologist in the proper sense, and that's Mr. John Carpay, who's president and founder of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. As you know, on this program, we frame our discussion in terms of a quotation, an aphorism. And the one I've chosen for today is from a man named Frederick Douglass, who is a famous freedom fighter of the Civil War period, the emancipation days in the United States. I would encourage anyone to Google Frederick Douglass. His story is one of great triumph and integrity and courage. Anyway, he said this, he said, "Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have the exact measure of the injustice and wrong which will be imposed on them." And part of the reason why I've chosen that quotation for today is because of, as I said, the character of the man who is our special guest today, and that's Mr. John Carpay. John Carpay was born in the Netherlands and grew up in British Columbia. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science at Laval University in Quebec City and his law degree from the University of Calgary. John is fluent in English, French, and Dutch, and he's also functional in German. John served the Canadian Taxpayers Federation as Alberta Director from 2001 to 2005, advocating for lower taxes, less waste, and accountable government. He was called to the bar in Alberta in 1999. He has been an advocate for freedom and the rule of law in constitutional cases across Canada. As the founder and the president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, John has devoted his legal career to defending constitutional freedoms through litigation and education. He considers it a privilege to advocate for courageous and principled clients who take great risks and make tremendous personal sacrifices by resisting the unjust demands of intolerant government authorities. In 2010, John received the Pyramid Award for Ideas in Public Policy in recognition of his work in constitutional advocacy and his success in building up and managing a nonprofit organization to defend citizens' freedoms. On the website, John describes the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms as follows. He says, "We are a Canadian legal organization and federally registered charity that defends citizens' fundamental freedoms under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms through pro bono, that's free, legal representation, and through educating Canadians about the free society." And I should also mention that John is a prolific writer. He writes on a number of topics, mostly within the realm of politics and culture. And you will find his writings, if you Google him, you'll find his writings all over the internet, but principally he's been published in the Post-Millennial, in the Western Standard, and others. So here is the man before us, Mr. John Carpay. Thanks for being with us today, John.
Hey, glad to be with you, Leighton.
Welcome to Grey Matter. The goal today is to have a meaningful discussion, to get into some of the deeper ideas, the world of ideas in which you really live and work. I know structurally the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, it exists sort of on an institutional level, on a functional level. But what I'd really like to talk about today is not so much what the Justice Center is doing on the surface, but I'm really interested to know what sort of inspired you and motivated you to found the Justice Center and what you see as its mission. So I want to get down into the world of ideas and ideology and what you think the Justice Center can and should be doing, needs to be doing, and also what we who are not part of the Justice Center can be doing in our, in our sort of our daily lives to further the objectives of the Justice Center. But before we go there, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your personal professional biography. Obviously, from the little blurb that I gave at the start, you have a very fascinating background. I understand you immigrated to Canada and that you have Dutch roots. Would you like to talk about that a little bit and your family background?
Well, I was born in the city of Utrecht, or as most people in Canada would say, Utrecht, which is the fourth largest city in the Netherlands. It's about 30 kilometers southeast of Amsterdam. It's right in the middle of the country. And when I was 7.5, I was with the family moved to Canada, to the little town of Kitimat, BC, just south of the Alaska Panhandle, which is a huge contrast. I mean, there's a basic similarity in that they're both part of a Judeo-Christian Western civilization, but that's about the only commonality. Going from a very ancient city that has been populated since the time of the Romans. We've got buildings that are 800 years, 900 years old. You've got these beautiful canals in the downtown core, and then go to a tiny little village of 14,000 people that was built very rapidly in the 1950s to house the workers for the Alcan aluminum plant, which is the largest employer in Kitimat, and not knowing a word of English. So I suddenly went from, unilingual Dutch, being in this ancient, not small city, 250,000 people and then suddenly find myself in this English-only small city where the oldest building in town, dates back to 1960.
So what brought your family over from Holland?
It was a family thing. It was my mom wanting to marry my stepfather, who was also from the Netherlands, and so that's why she made the trek. She was 35 years old, and she did know some English, but also had to work on it to become fluent. And so that's what precipitated the move to Kitimat. And I was there for 4 years, the last part of grade 2, and then grades 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then from grade 7 to 12, I was in another small town in BC, Williams Lake, which is halfway between Prince George and Kamloops, for those who are familiar with the BC geography. And graduated from high school there in 1985.
And then did you move on immediately to university and all the way out in Quebec City? That must have been quite a cultural experience again, almost a little bit of going home, with Quebec City being sort of a European type of environment.
Yeah, that's very true. I did 1 year at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and then at the end of my first year of university, I then went to Laval in Quebec City for 3 years, and that I foolishly or brilliantly or both, I started to study political science at a French language university where French was the language of instruction, but all I had was grade 12 French. So I was kind of at the, bonjour, comment allez-vous? And not, I had some vocabulary, a little bit of grammar, but like nowhere close to fluent, right? If you can just picture somebody with just grade 12 French. And that was a forced rapid immersion. And I got disastrous marks. I failed a course or two and I got low marks. But at the end of the first year, I was close to fluent, and then I had 2 more years there. And at the end of 3 years, I was totally fluent. And so I don't regret the lower marks. It's been a good thing, especially in Canada, to be fluent in French, and I've still been able to retain it today. And so that's been fun because recently the Justice Center we're expanding into Quebec, and so even though every lawyer in Quebec is bilingual, it's still better. I've got my French language, and it's just better for networking in Quebec and meeting people and getting things off the ground there.
So what was it that drew you out to the province of Quebec from British Columbia, as opposed to going to school, say, in staying in British Columbia or staying in Western Canada? What was it that drew you to the province of Quebec? Did you seek out this French language immersive experience?
That was the main motivation, was to become fluent in French. And I think the best way to acquire fluency in any language, right, but Chinese, Spanish, doesn't matter what, you go to a place where people speak it. Preferably put yourself into a milieu where there's a unilingual, right? So you go to if you want to learn Spanish, go to a village where it's full of unilingual Spanish speakers. Or if you want to learn Chinese, go to a village in China where that's the only language that anybody knows. And then you get forced to learn quite rapidly. Whereas if you know that the other person can speak English, you're actually at a disadvantage because you don't try as hard. You don't have that sense of desperation that will propel you forward at a rapid pace. If you know that the other guy or the other gal can speak English, you just don't have that pressure. So, I mean, obviously there are a lot of people in Quebec City that speak English, but it's much more of a French environment than, say, Montreal.
The being immersed in the language is also an excellent way to become familiar with a foreign, let's say, a foreign culture. And it sounds as though, French Canadian culture was somewhat foreign to you, even though you're a Western Canadian. But also during that time frame when you would have been studying in Quebec, must have been a very fascinating, and because it was such a vibrant time in Quebec. You were there, it sounds like, roughly 10, 12 years, within 6 or 7 years of the first referendum. And that period of politics in Quebec was leading up to, of course, the 95 referendum. So was that environment something that really sparked your interest in politics and culture?
I think my interest in politics started when I was a teenager in grade 10 social studies, and I just found it very intriguing and fascinating. That we had a model parliament, like our social studies teacher. Everybody could become an MLA, or I don't know if it was MP for federal, but we had our little model parliament amongst the 30 students, and you could pick a political party, or you could be an independent, and you could. So we had debates, and the social studies teacher talked about the political spectrum and left wing and right wing and what those concepts meant and entailed. And I just got very, very hooked very, very quickly. And now 40 years later, now I'm 54 and I'm still super interested in politics, more so in the ideas and the public policy. I mean, I'm not active in, not active federally or provincially with political parties. But in terms of public policy and ideas, I remain super interested.
I was speaking recently with another guest who was on the podcast. Her name is Susan Stanfield. You might be familiar with her, but she went to university around the same time that you and I did, in the mid to late 1980s. And she was describing, I think, sort of a thought process that I expect you would identify with, where she went to university to get a sort of a liberal arts education without any particular goal of getting into a certain job or anything like that. And as part of that, we discussed, what the university environment was like at that time. And her sense, like mine, was that although there certainly were leftist ideas there at that time, it did not appear that they had completely taken over the university the way they have now, to the point where, and I'm sure you hear these stories because I know the Justice Center is involved with advocating on behalf of students, where really the faculties, especially in humanities, are so dominated by leftist thinkers and socialist thought, and people who are advocating things like critical race theory, diversity, inclusion, equity, things of that nature, that it's really put a pall over the type of free thought that was really the essence of the university, I thought, in those days when I was there. to the point where students actually have to tailor their research projects and the opinions that they express in them to satisfy, woke sort of professors. Was that your impression when you were at Laval in those days, that it was much more of a liberal arts type of environment, and that you weren't under this type of leftist pressure in your studies?
Yeah, I was at UBC 85 to 86, and I was at Laval from 86 to 89, and the climate was very different from what I've seen in the last 5 years, 10 years. I think the difference was, in the 80s, probably, if I had to guess at the politics of my political science instructors or other instructors at UBC, probably majority of the profs, I think, would you could fairly say that they had left-wing views, but there was a much stronger commitment to debate. I never experienced, so in 4 years from 1985 to 1989, in 4 years of university at 2 universities, not once did I ever see calls. There was no cancel culture. Never saw that somebody came to campus and was going to be shut down. Just the very idea that you would censor somebody else because you declared, preemptively that their views were unacceptable. Term we've heard recently from our prime minister, right? People with unacceptable views. Just this whole notion that you could silence somebody else and shut them up, and that you were entitled to shut up other people, and that you were entitled to prevent other people from speaking. That notion, if it was there, I never saw it. It was so there was kind of maybe a left-wing dominance of sorts in terms of what was in the faculty, the people there. But there wasn't the cancel culture, and there wasn't that conformity. And it wasn't until I got to law school about 6 years in 1995, so a decade later, right? So I started law school a decade after because I had 6 years between my 2 degrees, and it wasn't until law school that I ever considered any kind of self-censorship. But in my undergrad, unpopular ideas, the idea was, well, you ignore the person or you refute what they're saying, but there's no third option of getting them banned from campus. That just didn't exist.
So you had a bit of a break there for a few years between graduating with your Bachelor of Arts and then moving on to law school. So was it anything besides law school that drew you to Calgary, or did you end up moving to Calgary so that you could attend the University of Calgary and begin your law degree?
I moved to Calgary to start law school, and prior to my move, I was living in BC. So after I graduated from Laval in Quebec City, I moved to Ottawa. I was there for about a year and a half, worked on the Hill. Part of that time, I was a special assistant to Tom Siddon, who was Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, and so learned a lot. Got to see a little bit of an inside glimpse on government on the Hill, and then I moved back to BC and ended up. I ran for Parliament at the young age of 26. I ran in the federal election of 1993 for the Reform Party. And then in 1995, I moved to Calgary to start law school. And I remember driving across the border. I had this little Colt 100, otherwise known as an Eagle Vista. It was this little Mitsubishi car, 2-door hatchback. And all of my possessions were loaded into this little car. I didn't own very much, and drove from BC, drove out to Calgary to start law school. And I remember coming into the outskirts of Calgary, and there's a Shell station there, and gas was 45 cents a liter, which was a lot cheaper than in BC. And I thought, I'll probably never leave Alberta.
Wow, 45 cents a liter sounds awfully good today, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah.
I want to talk to you about the Reform Party. I'm intrigued by this because obviously those of us who remember the Reform Party know that it had a very distinct ideological foundation. And I was actually listening to a podcast recently where the one of the founders of the Reform Party, whom I expect you know well, Mr. Preston Manning, was talking to Jordan Peterson on his podcast, and he said some interesting things that I kind of want to bounce off you. He said that the Reform Party proved something that existed at that time and may not exist now, but it proved that if you get the right people together who are committed and they have good ideas, it proves that you could really move the political process. Because of course that party went from, meeting at a hotel in the late 1980s to forming the official opposition within a period of less than 10 years. And Mr. Manning said that part of the reason why is because the party had a very specific vision of what it wanted to do. It was principled, and it stood for those principles, so that when they went out and they asked for support, and they went grassroots, they went to schools, and they went out and they campaigned in communities, which Mr. Manning thinks is very, very important, and something that isn't happening enough right now, by the way. I'm sure you'd agree with that. But would you agree with that? That was a big part of the success of the Reform Party. And that's one question. The other part of it is, what was it that drew you to the Reform Party? Because obviously the Reform Party, as we know, had a very specific ideological picture. And you must have been drawn to that in order to take that so seriously as to run as a candidate for the party as a member of Parliament. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, what drew me to the Reform Party was the beliefs and the principles and the ideas. And I think you could summarize, there are obviously many different ways to summarize it. My way to summarize the Reform Party philosophically is that there were three overlapping streams. There were the libertarians who believed in maximum freedom for the individual, smaller government. Government should stick to things that only government can do, like establishing and maintaining an independent and impartial court system, and providing for national defense, providing for a police force to enforce a limited number of laws. So you need your laws against murder and theft and rape and assault and fraud and some other things, but by and large, government should just provide a framework in which people can live free lives, live independently, make their own choices, make their own voluntary associations, have their own business contracts. And the opposite of that would be socialism, where the government is not just the referee that enforces the rules, but the government gets in there and is a player as well in terms of using coercive power to redistribute wealth. So you had a libertarian stream in the Reform Party that would say, look, maximum freedom for the individual, smaller government. You had a conservative stream. Conservatism is harder to define than libertarianism because it can mean and does mean different things to different people. And then there's a populist and democratic accountability stream within the Reform Party that emphasized recall. So you can fire your MP. If your MP is doing a good job, a poor job, there should be a mechanism there to recall the MP that's breaking promises or just not doing what he or she's supposed to do. Referendum or referenda on major issues, abortion or capital punishment or immigration policy, whatever, put the decision to the people. And citizens initiative. So if there's an issue that politicians are refusing to discuss, that they keep on sweeping under the rug, a group of citizens can gather signatures and put an issue on the ballot for other people to vote on. So those were the three kind of streams of the Reform Party: the Conservatives, the Libertarians, the populists, democratic accountability. I think most Reform Party supporters agreed to varying extents with all three, and yeah, I would be in that category as well. I was sympathetic to kind of all three of those, so that's what drew me to the party.
So, running for Parliament as a relatively young man, though, was a big step, and I'm curious about this because I, as the listeners can probably guess, I know you a little bit better than most of the guests who are on the show, and I know that you have something of this. I'll call it a protective gene. I've called you, and I mean this in the proper sense, an apologist, someone who sticks up for other people. You don't like it when people get pushed around, and you're one of the people who steps into the fray and says, hey, that's wrong, stop that, and if you don't, I'm going to do something about it. So were there things happening around that time in the, let's say, in the political discourse and the culture of Canada that concerned you greatly, and was that the reason why you decided to run for Parliament?
Well, I wanted to run for Parliament because I was ambitious to become a member of Parliament. That's a desire that was very strong in my life from the time of a teenager, and I'd say right on through to roughly the age of 30. Not interested in that today, but yeah, in terms of the issues, I mean, I remember we had a pamphlet. The Reform Party had a pamphlet or a flyer, and the front of it said, in Ottawa, every special interest group counts except for one: Canadians. And so this was a system where you had the Liberal, Conservative, NDP were the only three parties, and they routinely passed all kinds of legislation that there's just no opposition to it. And there was kind of a Central Canadian elitist understanding of what was appropriate. And if you disagreed with that, some of the cancel culture ad hominem attacks that you see today, we've got a huge problem today in 2022 where the accusation of, racist, misogynist, extremist, anti-science, that kind of cheap name calling is so prevalent. It's way more prevalent than before. But you could see the origins of that already in the early 1990s when the Reform Party was founded in 1987, ran candidates in 1988. The big growth period was from 1988 to 1993. The party just grew and then got 52 seats in the 1993 election. You could already see then that there's this elite establishment that looked upon, if you disagreed with this, the huge deficits, Mulroney government was just raking up debt. If you disagreed with funding for multiculturalism, if you disagreed with funding for the court challenges program that paid radical feminists and other special interest groups to go into court and advance certain causes and use the court system to bypass democracy. If you disagreed with immigration policy, if you disagreed with any of these issues, you were deemed to be a kook, an idiot, a racist. I remember Preston Manning came out to speak in Burnaby, and Burnaby is the city east of Vancouver, and I was running in the North Burnaby side. Preston Manning came to Burnaby. It was sometime in 1992-93 for a speaking event, and there was these protesters outside, and they were chanting, "Racist, sexist, anti-gay, born-again bigots, go away." And so just complete, so saying, if you're a Reform Party, racist, sexist, right, misogynist, anti-female, anti-gay, born-again, which I think was intended to be an insult, bigot, definitely an insult, go away. So, but now that name calling culture and the refusal to debate is, I think, much worse than what it was in the early 90s, 20 years ago.
Well, and now it's not people outside chanting those things. It's
the
the Prime Minister saying, yes.
The Prime Minister said
leader
that
of the country.
people that are not taking this COVID shot are anti-science, misogynist, racist, extremist, who should not be tolerated.
Right.
Yeah, the Prime Minister of the country is operating at the same level as those, peaceful protesters that were chanting outside of a Reform Party meeting 20 years ago.
He might have been one of them in those days. So after that period when you ran for Parliament, you at some point became involved with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, right? How did that come about?
Well, got involved with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation twice. Once was before I went to law school, I spent a few months working as a fundraiser for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So I was part of the, I think they were called field agents, and just going door to door, calling on businesses, asking them to donate to the Taxpayers Federation. So I did that work for a while. But then it was after law school, I was working at a small firm in Calgary, which no longer exists. It was called Rooney Prentice, and that was Jim Rooney, who is still a lawyer today practicing with law firm Denton's. And Prentice was Jim Prentice, who later became the Premier of Alberta in 2015. So I was working for this small law firm, Rooney Prentice, and I was doing civil litigation, which meant that I was never in court. A junior associate at the firm doing civil litigation. And I really loved being in court. I'd been in court a lot when I was in law school. I volunteered with student legal assistance. So I was in traffic court. I was defending people, on speeding tickets, running a red light, driving without insurance, careless driving. So I was in traffic court on the defense side. As well as even in criminal court, I ran some trials, people accused of shoplifting, people accused of assault. I did speak to sentence on impaired driving. So this would be the defense, somebody who's pleading guilty, and I would speak to the sentence as to, leniency should be there because they have no criminal record and it's their first offense. And what are the reasons as to why they should have leniency, right? With the Crown taking the opposite viewpoint and arguing their viewpoint. And so I loved being in court. And then I was practicing law at Rooney Prentice, and I was just always behind a desk and never in court. And so that's when I found out the Canadian Taxpayers Federation was looking for an Alberta director. And after practicing law for only a year and a half with Rooney Prentice, I applied and got the job and left and moved off to Edmonton and worked for the Taxpayers Federation for the next 4.5 years.
It was there that you met Jason Kenney, right?
No, I met Jason.
You know where I'm going.
I met Jason Kenney in 1992 when I was a Reform Party candidate. We were introduced to each other by a mutual friend. So I've known Jason actually for 30 years, although we've never been close. We've been more, along the lines of acquaintances. We've never had a close friendship.
But you were both involved with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, or were you there at different times?
We were there at different times. Jason Kenney left in 1997 it was late 1996, actually. I did some volunteer work on Jason Kenney's nomination campaign when he was running to go after the Reform Party nomination in Calgary Southeast, which was a seat. The Reform Party MP there was Jan Brown, and she had a falling out with Preston Manning, and she had kind of left the party. And so there was a vacant seat. So Jason in 1996 stepped down from the Taxpayers Federation and went after the seat in Calgary Southeast and won the Reform Party nomination and got elected in June of 1997. And so I joined the Canadian Taxpayers Federation 4 years later. So quite a ways, 5 years after Jason had left.
You did have a rather public disagreement with Mr. Kenny, that we're going to talk about a bit later. But before we go there, I'd like
Yeah,
to hear
many,
more
not just
about.
one.
Well, you can talk about as many as you like, but there's one that I know of that I want you to talk about if you're willing to do it.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to know what sort of events inspired you to found the Justice Center. How did the Justice Center come about, both as an idea and as a project and a reality? How did that come about?
Well, it goes back to 2005. I was working for the Taxpayers Federation. I had been there for over 4 years, and I still enjoyed the job very much, but it was becoming less challenging because it was my, into my 5th year of working there, and I felt like I could do some of the media interviews in my sleep, and so I was kind of starting to, keep my eyes open for other opportunities. And one day there were 3 people that emailed me the same email that there was a libertarian-oriented, freedom-oriented, public interest law firm called the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and they were looking to hire a full-time executive director. And so I was intrigued by this because the organization was committed to defending charter freedoms, and they had, up until that point, they hadn't really done all that much, which is understandable. If you don't have full-time staff, you tend to not get stuff done. And that's it's not a criticism. That's just normal for a lot of organizations. They get off the ground and they start slow and it takes them a while. But they had decided to hire a full-time executive director. So I applied for that position and I got it. And so in 2005, I moved back to Calgary and to get the Canadian Constitution Foundation off the ground. And I worked there for the next 5 years. And so that was just a great opportunity to, I guess, gain more experience in nonprofit management and fundraising. And we ran court cases, and it was very much similar to what the Justice Center was doing. Unfortunately, I had a falling out with the board of directors. There was a lot of friction there. So they brought an end to my employment after 5 years, which was incredibly heartbreaking and painful and difficult at the time. But that's when I started the Justice Center, because I wanted to continue the same type of public interest legal work, and to be a voice for freedom in Canada's courtrooms. And I wanted to continue with that. So in 2010, I started the Justice Center, and and continued doing the same kind of work, except now it's on a much larger scale than what the CCF ever was. I mean, we have 15 staff lawyers full-time. We've got 11 full-time paralegals. We've got at least a dozen, if not 24, outside counsel that are on contract with us. We are running hundreds of court cases all over Canada, many of them ticket cases where somebody got a $2,000 ticket for peacefully protesting outdoors at a rally, those types of cases. So that's how I got into the Justice Center. I wanted to use my law degree and my legal education, legal training, to be an advocate for freedom in Canada's courtrooms. And that's where it's at.
So obviously you had a very clear vision of what you wanted to do when you started the Justice Center. And now we're 12 years on. How would you compare your original vision with the reality of how things have developed with the Justice Center? In other words, do you think that that the Justice Center right now is living up to its mission? And I know this is a tough question because you're the founder, you're the one who's got his hands on the reins. But I know that sometimes, so often, I know you see this a lot. An organization gets started, and political parties are a great example. And everything sounds good in the beginning. They have a sort of a wonderful mission, but then as time goes on and they grow the way the Justice Center has, they tend to lose sight of that original mission. Do you still think that the Justice Center is on point? And if it is, tell us why you think so, and how that's been accomplished.
we're in a very different position from political parties. I think what happened with the Reform Party is that the growth was slow and steady, and my guess, and I don't know what was going on in Preston Manning's mind, but my impression is he was getting impatient with how long it was taking, and so we had that shift from Reform Party to Canadian Alliance, and then Canadian Alliance went into this new Conservative Party. And so, unfortunately, the whole Reform Party project really got killed off because, I mean, when you've got somebody like Aaron O'Toole leading the Conservatives, that's not the Reform Party from 20 years ago. But it's harder for political parties because they are dependent on voters at large, and if you don't get that magical 40%, 42%, 45%, or 35% in a depending on how the vote splits. But if you don't get that solid block of voters, you're not going to have power. And so politicians frequently get tired of advocating for the right things from the opposition benches, not understanding that sometimes you have amazing power from opposition benches to advance ideals which you pressure the government into adopting. And I think the NDP has been spectacularly successful in Canada in getting its policies implemented. That's a whole other topic. Anyway, for the Justice Center, for any other charity, it's a little bit easier. It's a lot easier, actually, because we are accountable to our donors and nobody else. So if 99% of Canadians disagree with what the Justice Center stands for and what we're doing, and I think it's a whole lot less than 99%. I'm using that as an extreme example. But if 99% of Canadians disagree with what we're doing, we don't really care because we are funded by our donors, and it's our donors that are our strength, which is why we have the 15 staff lawyers and the 11 paralegals and the half dozen administrative and communications staff and all of the outside counsel and the hundreds of court cases. It's because of our donors. So in a way, my job is it's easy to stay true to our mission because really the only people that I'm out to please and that I'm accountable to is our donors. And everybody else, it's like, well, sure, I'll listen to what you have to say, but not necessarily going to be deeply moved by it.
So the mission of the Justice Center fundamentally is the protection of individual civil liberties in Canada, correct? Is that, or is that boiling it down too much?
Yes, that would be one of several accurate ways to describe it. Yeah, individual freedom, individual civil liberties. More recently, I've often been using the word, basic human rights. I've been using that more often, although that term has been somewhat corrupted in the past, the expression human rights. But, we can talk about, constitutional freedoms, civil liberties, individual freedoms, human rights.
The first time that I learned of you and the work that you were doing with the Justice Center is a case that happened about 8 years ago involving Ezra Levant. And it was involving an allegation basically of Islamophobia. If you remember this case, and I remember he had been, there was a complaint that was leveled against him by another member of the Law Society.
By any chance?
This was the one involving, I think it was Mr. Chuck, Armin Chuck.
Okay,
do you remember this case?
Right.
Yeah. So I remember reading about this, and the reason why I mentioned it is because I remember reading it at the time, and I was a little bit in the dark about some of the stuff that was going on. But then when I went back and reviewed that again in preparation for our talk today, I was very struck by how you had weighed in, and you'd sort of come to the aid of Mr. Levant, in that you said, well, this is in the realm of free speech, right? And that we shouldn't be chilling criticism of ideas, and we shouldn't be making an ad hominem attack against somebody who is exercising free speech when they're really not attacking the speaker. And when I went back and looked at it now, some of those things that were bubbling to the surface back in 2014 now seem so prescient, in terms of the wokeness, the using the sort of the leftist attack, or let's call it a defense of Islamophobia. Saying that somebody has, as you were saying, unacceptable views. That was really the allegation that was leveled against Mr. Levant. But I was struck when I went back and looked at it again, how that was the first time I was really aware of this stuff going on. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Did you notice that in the first few years that you started the Justice Center, you were seeing more and more of this type of public discourse?
Well, I think Canada has gotten worse in the past 11 years when it comes to the free society, when it comes to the rule of law. That's one we might be able to get into later today, a breakdown in the rule of law with just the double standards about different kinds of protests. And if you're protesting for a cause that the government likes, then you can engage in illegal behavior and get away with it. But if the government does not like the cause that you are protesting for, then you can get trampled by police horses, even if your behavior has been peaceful. Sorry, I digress. But there's a breakdown in the rule of law. There's a breakdown in the rights of parents to be able to raise and educate their own children. Breakdown in all of the fundamental freedoms, which in the Charter would be the freedoms of expression and religion and conscience and peaceful assembly and freedom of association, and even a breakdown now, the Charter right to bodily autonomy, that every person gets to decide what will or will not be injected into their own bodies without force, without duress, without pressure, without coercion. So I think Canada's declined in the last decade, the last 2 decades. But I could see that, and I think, well, I don't know if using the word phobia is hugely problematic. There are legitimate phobias. A phobia is an irrational fear. So arachnophobia is an irrational fear of spiders. So if you live in Canada and you're scared of your average Canadian basement spider, and there are real poisonous spiders in Canada as well. You've got the black widow and perhaps another kind. But by and large, most of the spiders you're going to encounter are not poisonous. So they're not a real threat. So arachnophobia is an irrational fear of spiders. Agoraphobia is a fear of open spaces, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so a phobia is a real thing. It's an irrational fear. The problem with Islamophobic, homophobic, transphobic, and all these other labels is they shut down debate, because what they basically say is, you've got a mental illness if you disagree with Islam, or you've got a mental illness if you disagree with the political agenda that is being advocated by some LGBTQ people. And so you can't disagree with their politics without being labeled effectively as being mentally ill, because a phobia is a mental illness. So this kind of language is insidious. And of course, it's been in use now for way more than a decade with the transphobic, homophobic, Islamophobic. It's bad news for free speech.
Right. Yeah. And this actually hit you personally, didn't it? Because it led to your own sort of cancel culture experience, where I believe you were giving a talk and talking about, you made a comparison of the LGBTQ flag to the Nazi swastika, not a direct comparison, but you were using by analogy, using the use of symbols in order to promote a certain political idea. But then that got turned into something very, very different, didn't it? And it was used to launch the same type of attack that you're talking about on you personally, even though your discussion was about on the level of ideas. This was leveled as a personal attack against you in the public discourse. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think it's a fascinating story.
So I was giving a speech in November of 2018. It was shortly before, it was the Remembrance Day weekend. It was a day or two prior to Remembrance Day that I spoke. And I talked about what the then education minister, David Eggen, was pushing a very anti-parent agenda. He was threatening to shut down Christian schools in Alberta unless the Christian schools adopted anti-bullying policies that were contrary to their own statements of belief, right? Which is a very totalitarian action. I mean, it's one thing for a government to say that okay, every school must have an anti-bullying policy, although from a libertarian perspective, I would say it's not really the purview or the duty of the provincial government to dictate that, because that should be up to every local school as to what kind of anti-bullying policy they want to have and whether it's written or unwritten. So I mean, it's a violation of this very sensible principle of decentralization and letting people run things at the local level. But apart from I guess libertarian objections about having provincially mandated anti-bullying policies, apart from that, this was also an attack on religious freedom and parental rights, where the Alberta schools in question did not have the freedom to come up with their own anti-bullying policy. It had to be David Eggen's anti-bullying policy, and that was a very ideological policy that was contrary to what these Christian and Jewish and Sikh schools themselves believed in. So it was a very aggressive state assault on parental rights. And so I made the point, which I've made hundreds of times, and I'm sure I'll make it again in the future, which is governments never violate your rights and freedoms without coming up with a pretext or a nice sounding cause, right? So if you want to terrorize people, if you want to be a dictator, you need an enemy. So you need to say, well, we all got to be very afraid of who? Of the terrorists, of the communists, of the Muslims, of the Jews, of the this, of the capitalists, of the criminal, whatever. You got to have your boogeyman that is, the threat. And then you got to come in there like the savior and say, well, I'm going to save you from those nasty capitalists or the evil communists or this or that or whatever. So I'm going to take away your rights and freedoms. It's for your own good. It's to protect you from the bad guys, right? And that's the same playbook that's being used over and over again. So I said all of that in the speech, and then I made what I think was a tactical mistake. I referred to 3 different ideologies in the same sentence. And then that was, the media played only that one sentence, and then that was mischaracterized. And so all the headlines, apparently all over the world, apparently got international coverage. Got a lot of coverage. One of my friends asked me if the idea had come to me by way of a PR agency that wanted to increase publicity for the Justice Center. And I said, no, this was on, we did not pay a PR agency to come up with this point. So what happened was there was a mischaracterization. So all these headlines said, well, Carpay compares rainbow flag to Nazi swastika. That was the headline. And it was misleading because I don't think that those two symbols are similar. I think those two symbols are very different. But the media mischaracterized it by saying that I was saying that the symbols were similar.
Right. Speaking of boogeymen, not long after that, along comes the COVID-19 virus and the pandemic. And of course, the Justice Center sprang into action. And this fighting on behalf of Canadians who have been impacted by really an unprecedented assault upon their civil liberties has become a major focus of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. And you've been sort of the curator of that on behalf of the Justice Center. It's been a very exciting and very challenging time. So what I'd like you to do is, and I know you have some thoughts about this, is to perhaps put COVID-19 and the quote-unquote pandemic in the context of what you were just saying about how governments, I know you just wrote a very fascinating paper about how to turn a society into a totalitarian regime. Let's talk about COVID-19. I'd like to get your thoughts in this context of how COVID-19 was really weaponized as a political agenda in order to spread fear and to disenfranchise Canadians from being a sort of a rights-based, civil liberties-based society into one that really lives at the mercy of government caprice.
Yeah, the Justice Center was one of the first or early voices in Canada that was skeptical. I remember lockdowns were introduced around Sunday, March 15th. I remember here in Alberta, Premier Kenney announced that there would be no school for the kids on Monday the 16th. And, the hardest part about the 2 weeks to flatten the curve has been the past 2 years. So it ended up being, 52 times as long as what was promised. But I did not come out when they brought in the 2 weeks to flatten the curve. I thought, well, okay, it's a new virus. We don't know too much about it. Maybe this is a good thing. And they said in the beginning, they changed this. The initial narrative was, we cannot stop the virus from spreading. It will go through all of society. That is inevitable. We can't stop it. We're not going to try to stop it. All we're trying to do is to reduce the speed of the spread, to make the spread more manageable so that we don't flood the hospitals all of a sudden. And that actually, in my view, that does hold some water. It makes sense if you say, well, yeah, no country, no civilization, no jurisdiction has ever succeeded in stopping a virus from spreading. But we can take some measures to slow it down a bit and kind of manage the spread while recognizing that this will spread everywhere. And that got changed in a very subtle fashion into, we need this permanent war to forever be trying to stop the spread of a virus, which is impossible. It's futile. You can't do that. I think what really changed things for me was when I started to ask the question in April. I asked, are you thinking about the harmful effects of lockdowns? Because yes, if I feel I have an 81-year-old mother who is vulnerable for COVID. I have as much compassion for COVID vulnerable people as anybody else. And I'm also thinking, okay, what can we do to protect the vulnerable and also protect everybody else from the harms of isolation and loneliness and all of the terrible impacts on public health that you get when you ban activities that are good for you, like going to the gym, playing in team sports, participating in team sports, watching team sports, singing in a choir, connecting in person with friends, putting on a school play and memorizing your lines and having the parents come out for that, watching your kids in a ballet performance. I mean, all of these things that are good for us, and this is demonstrable, all the scientific literature on what's good for our health. Have fun, enjoy yourself, socialize. Those are very effective ways to fight off cancer and mental illness and heart disease and lung disease. And, every major illness, the doctors and the scientists tell you, be active, participate in sports, be connected with other people. And so all these lockdown measures are obviously, evidently, they're terrible for public health. And then we get, the chief medical officer cancels tens of thousands of surgeries, and, people die because their life-saving surgery is canceled because the government said that their surgery is not important. So in April, we were 1 month into it, I started to ask questions like, well, what about the harmful effects? Are you tracking these? Are you paying attention to what they are? Are you making a list of all the harmful effects of lockdowns? And are you then making the effort to go down and obtain the data and obtain the facts? And in the face of all this propaganda about how the government was all scientific and it's all evidence-based, here we are 2 years later, and there's not a single government in Canada, federally, provincially, that has made a bona fide, sincere effort to track the lockdown harms. And that tells you everything about how honest and how scientific this project is.
So you're certainly, based on your writings, you're certainly convinced that what we've seen through the course of the pandemic, and I would say we're still in the pandemic era, because of course many people cannot get on a plane or a train or a boat in this country. We're prisoners in our own country. Is really a suspension of the rule of law. We've seen that, and an expression of totalitarianism, and in the sense that our government stopped making laws in the ways that we make laws in Canada through parliamentary functioning. Laws now are being made more along the lines of the way they are in countries where people are not elected. And what occurred in Alberta is amendments were made to the Provincial Health Act to make Dina Hinshaw the most powerful person in the history of Alberta, with the power to use any means necessary to fight COVID. And she used that power, and she continues to use that power. And so this, I take it, has been very, very alarming for you and for the Justice Centre, because the Justice Centre is very concerned about upholding respect for the rule of law. And our rulers, whether it's Justin Trudeau or Jason Kenney or others, they appear to regard themselves as being above the law. That's one problem. The other problem is they don't seem to have any respect for the rule of law in terms of preserving the individual rights of Canadians. And of course, as you know, in the Charter, the preamble says the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And it seems that both of those preconditions have not been respected during the course of the pandemic. Is it fair to say that's part of the concern that the Justice Centre has had, and why it has advocated so strongly against these lockdown measures?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the thing that got me the most interested right away was just the suffering that this was inflicting on people. And I personally have been very blessed. I've suffered a lot less than so many other people. I live with 5 other people. My wife and I have 4 kids, so I didn't experience the loneliness and isolation the way that a lot of other people were forced by these repressive policies. Were forced into isolation and loneliness, cut off from their support networks. And we know from the medical literature prior to COVID, because I trust it more. Any scientific paper written prior to March of 2020, I trust it more as not having political agenda. The literature was there that we need in-person connections. We have poorer mental health, even poorer physical health, when we are not face-to-face in the same room, at the same time. As Theo Fleury put it, it is catching each other's energy, sensing each other's energy, when you're with somebody else in the same room. Now, of course, Zoom and Skype and whatnot are great tools. They can enhance, make possible certain opportunities, like what we're doing with the 2 of us right now, talking remotely. Okay, that's fine, but they're not a substitute for the in-person connection. And so when government shredded the social fabric of our society, destroyed the sense of community and the micro communities that exist when people, who might not even be super close, but they're interacting with each other. And you see some of the same people at the gym all the time, or you see other parents at your child's sporting events, etc. So the first thing that really got to me was just the huge amount of suffering that, to use Alberta as an example, that Dina Hinshaw and Jason Kenney were inflicting on people. I think that's the first thing I found disturbing. And then after that, it's the 2 things that you mentioned. One, it's an attack on our charter freedoms, particularly the freedom of association, freedom of peaceful assembly. Also, we see massive attacks on the freedom of expression of medical doctors who cannot engage in the scientific process by questioning, by challenging, by debating. The whole scientific process has been shut down by the colleges of physicians and surgeons when it comes to having a open, honest, scientific debate and inquiry about COVID, COVID cures, the vaccines, vaccine harms, vaccine benefits. All debate has been shut down. So it's the charter freedoms are being violated, but also our very constitutional democracy itself, where we've moved from parliamentary democracy where laws are proposed, they are debated, they are voted on, and then ultimately approved through a democratic process. That went out the window, and suddenly you've got the chief medical dictator who is single-handedly, well, I guess in consultation with the premier, the chief medical officer. I've often referred to Premier Hinshaw and her lovely assistant Jason. I don't know which of the two is more in charge, but you get the premier and the chief medical officer together. They promulgate the laws that we have to live under on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, and the legislature is just frozen out. And that's terrible. And it's a total violation of our Constitution.
You mentioned a few things in there, a few threads I'd like to pick up. One of them is you mentioned Theo Fleury, and actually, I don't know if you're aware of this, John, but he was a guest on the program, and in fact, my interview with him just went up. It was available as of yesterday.
Okay.
One of the things that Theo Fleury said that really struck me, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Of course, we know he's been very public in disclosing his history of abuse, and he has a very specific purpose behind that, and that he wants to help others. But he's been very vocal in the public discourse about in the context that we're speaking right now. When I asked him why, he said something very, very interesting. He said that he was triggered because the cycle of abuse that he suffered as a teenager when he was a victim of sexual abuse, the same methods, the same abuse of power, the same manipulation, he senses is exactly what's happening to Canadians right now, and that these are tried and true abusive measures that are used are employed by all abusers. And I just found that I was struck by that because, of course, not having his perspective, it didn't occur to me. But don't you think that's a very, very interesting, very poignant view of the matter? And it seems to make so much sense, because you talk about just the pain that these lockdown measures and all of it has caused to Canadians. But what's your take on what Theo Fleury had to say about that?
Well, I agree. I think that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is not a psychological document or treatise, so you're not going to find the word abusive in the charter, at least to my knowledge, it's not in there. But fundamentally, it's accurate to say that these policies the last 2 years are abusive. What the federal government is doing now, making it, turning some Canadians into second-class citizens who are not allowed to get on an airplane without any credible scientific basis whatsoever. Well, we all know now that the government propaganda about the vaccines from 9 months ago, oh yeah, we're going to go back to normal and we're all going to acquire herd immunity and the vaccines will be the way to end lockdowns. Well, no, the vaccines came out, I think in April, May, June of 2021 is when most people took them. And even when you've got 70%, 80%, 90%, 95%, depending on which province, you've got the overwhelming majority of Canadians taking these new vaccines, which have not been subjected to any long-term safety testing. Something you have to agree with as a fact, whether you're a fan of these vaccines or not. You have to admit they've not been submitted to long-term safety testing. So the government lied to us and said, well, if we get 70%, 80% vaccination rates, we're all going to go back to normal. Well, no, we went back to masks and anti-social distancing, as I call it, and second-class citizenship for those that didn't want to, take part in what you could describe as, because of the absence of long-term safety testing, it is a kind of a medical experiment. Those who did not wish to participate became second-class citizens and are still second-class citizens. That's abusive. If if that kind of treatment, if you brought that down to a microcosm level to within a family or within a business or a place of employment, that's abusive. So yeah, I have to agree with Theo Fleury, who, by the way, he very kindly agreed to join me on one of my weekly podcasts 2 or 3 months ago. So, had the privilege of meeting him in person. And I think these policies are indeed abusive. And then how the other thing that Theo mentioned was the abuser he'll condition you and he'll say, well, if you do this, or if you don't do this or that, maybe I'll let you go out next week and you'll be allowed to go outside and go for an ice cream or something, right? He's going to grant you certain privileges. And here you have the government. It's the same playbook. It's like, okay, well, you know what? Like we're gonna let the unvaccinated people participate in team sports and go back to the gym. But, we still got the QR code system lined up. So whenever we feel like it, if we think that these case numbers are too high, we're going to turn you into second-class citizens once again. And it's just playing with your mind that way.
The other interesting thread from what you were saying before is talking about the harms of lockdowns. We also had Dr. Jay Bhattacharya on the program. And in that context, we were talking about something you alluded to earlier about the damage that's been done to the integrity of science through the chilling effect, because this whole, Dr. Bhattacharya described the whole panoply of science as this ongoing conversation. And this is how we come up with the best scientific ideas. So he talked about that, and so he agrees with you there. But speaking specifically about lockdowns, Dr. Bhattacharya said something that I was not aware of, and that is that if you take what, let's say, the Alberta government says is the reason for the lockdowns, that is health equity and social justice, that we're trying to protect people. Dr. Bhattacharya says, based upon hard economic data, that the people who are most adversely impacted by lockdowns are the poor. So that we know from medical data, from hard medical data, that the poor have the worst health outcomes anyway, COVID or otherwise. But then through these lockdowns, they have this double whammy. They're hit not only by these poor health outcomes, but they're worsened because these economic policies, they hit the poor the worst. And so this is why he says he agrees with you that these lockdowns are just the worst possible idea. My question for you is, why don't governments realize this? Why don't they listen to the Dr. Bhattacharyas? Why are people like Dr. Bhattacharya and the other architects of the Great Barrington Declaration, for example, being called fringe epidemiologists? Even now, even with all that we know now, apparently, about COVID, even now, people like Dr. Bhattacharya are being discredited regularly online in public discourse. So why is the government doing this? Like, what's going on at a deeper level? Like, in other words, what's really behind these lockdowns? If they're not really there to protect people from COVID, then why are they there? What is at the heart of it in your view?
I think it's a combination of inertia, right? If you've got a big heavy train that's moving down the tracks, or big cruise ship in the ocean that's moving along, a cruise ship cannot turn around 180 degrees in a few seconds the way that a small speedboat can, if necessary, can do a U-turn within a matter of a few seconds. The ocean liner can't do it. The big train can't do it. So we've got buy-in from the medical establishment aggressively. The Justice Center is representing well over a dozen medical doctors all over Canada that are facing disciplinary proceedings simply for speaking up their professional opinions about lockdown harms, about COVID treatments, about vaccines, efficacy of vaccines, all of those issues. So the medical establishment is like, is like the train or the big cruise ship in the ocean. It's moving in one direction. The legal establishment, you've got courts declaring that unvaccinated people cannot serve on a jury. Unvaccinated people are not allowed to set foot in the courthouse. The Law Society of Alberta requiring all Law Society staff to be vaccinated. So you've got the legal establishment, the medical establishment, the media establishment, and then you've got the politicians who are more followers than leaders. And so you've got this tremendous inertia, and then you combine that with the basic human. It's hard to say that we're wrong, right? We all, I think, that from experience, right? It's hard to say, I was wrong, I'm sorry. And so there's a lot of pride and ego involved to make it very hard, I think, for any for doctors, for judges, for law societies, for politicians, for various authorities, for employers, for school boards, for teachers' unions. It's very, very hard to stop and say that they were wrong. So I think that's a big problem. The last point, very briefly, and this is something Theo Fleury mentioned to me. He says the most powerful addiction, and the one that's hardest to get free from, is an addiction to power. And it must feel amazing for the likes of Jason Kenney and Dina Hinshaw. You've got this, like who in history has had more power? You can tell people how to live, where to go, where not to go, who they can meet with, who they cannot meet with, what they can do, what they cannot do. Like, there's no tyrant in history. Even Stalin and Hitler and Mao, and they didn't have this kind of power over people's daily lives to be able to really control other people. So I think that can be part of it as well, as a power addiction.
So I know that the Justice Center was very supportive of their recent Freedom Convoy. And obviously, I mean, the reasons for doing that are, I guess, somewhat obvious from what we've heard from you. But talking about this concept of power, John, recently, and not just recently, but even while, let's say, people are coming out of the hardcore restrictions, the federal government is now engaging in, and provincial governments are engaging, for example, in Ontario, in imposition of a law which would institutionalize critical race theory. During the pandemic, the Canadian government made changes to the criminal code, which essentially made it criminal to teach certain time-honored Christian beliefs about gender and the role and the essence of men and women. And we have this coalition now between, let's say, a leftist coalition between Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Singh. We have a situation where some of the individuals who are involved in the Freedom Convoy are suffering persecution. We're seeing really an unprecedented change to the law of bail in Canada, where judges are imposing really, to my mind, absurdly restrictive conditions, which clearly are in violation of the Charter. So this abuse of power is very, very deep right now. It almost appears like COVID-19 set the stage. It set the conditions now for these governments to really go for broke. And so my question for you is, in that context, where is this leading? There's a lot of talk, for example, about the World Economic Forum and the 2030 agenda. And but where is this going? Where do you see this going in Canada if we don't stop the train, to use your analogy? If we can't get the ocean liner turned around, what's the end game for these governments in your mind?
They're acting out of the tyrant's playbook. There's a recent column of mine on the Post-Millennial. I think it's called the Tyrant's Playbook: Lessons for Canada, or How to Become a Tyrant. This is, by the way, this is a 6-part Netflix series, and it's called How to Become a Tyrant. It's fairly new. I think it came out last year. very well done in my view, and a lot of interesting historical things, many of which I either had never known or had forgotten about. But they talk about Hitler and Stalin and Mao. They talk about Idi Amin, who ruled in Uganda in the 1970s. They talk about Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and so on. And they talk about this playbook. And the Canadian politicians are taking pages out of the tyrant's playbook in taking us towards tyranny. When you get a nonviolent person like Tamara Leach, who is a Justice Center client, who was jailed for 18 days, who was kept in prison and denied bail initially by a judge who had been a Liberal Party candidate in the 2011 election, and who then gets bail conditions imposed on her that she cannot speak publicly her opinions about Freedom Convoy or about the lockdown restrictions or vaccine passport. She's not allowed to speak publicly her own opinions. And, I don't practice in criminal law, but my understanding from a lot of criminal law lawyers I've talked to is that you typically are not denied bail. If you have no criminal record and you're not charged with a violent offense, you get your typical undertaking to keep the peace and be of good behavior, and you're on your way, you're out of jail. We don't jail people who have no criminal record and are not even charged with a violent offense. And so to have these bail conditions, it's no longer directly related to COVID, but it's just taking a page out of the tyrant's playbook. This will continue in the wrong direction unless and until Canadians in sufficient numbers peacefully oppose it and peacefully object to it.
So that's part of the plan. I was recently speaking to a woman who was a very active protester during the COVID-19 pandemic, and she actually left Canada and moved to Britain with her husband. Her husband is a British national, and so she's living in England right now. And she gave us a very, very interesting perspective, in that she thinks that those of us in Canada are somewhat living under a media blackout. In other words, we're sort of at ground zero. And she says that we have no idea how poorly Canada is being seen internationally. And of course, we saw a little bit about this in recent days when some members of the European Parliament really publicly chastised and scolded our Prime Minister. I don't have any hope that had a meaningful impact upon him, but it certainly was a sign of hope for many Canadians who are sensing this being under the jackboot of the totalitarianism that you're talking about. Do you think that that's a sign of hope, that the international community is becoming more and more aware of what our rulers in Canada are doing to us? Or do you think that's perhaps a faint hope, that we have to really focus on the things that we can do every day in our daily lives to resist this totalitarianism?
Well, Canadian media does eventually catch up with international media when it comes to covering things taking place in Canada. A few years ago, there was a transgender activist, last name Yaniv, and Yaniv was in British Columbia, and trans woman, I guess, or trans man, whichever. But Yaniv had the male private parts and wanted to get a Brazilian bikini wax, and went to immigrant women and said, I want you to give me a wax job. And the women said, no, like we don't do men. And of course, Yaniv says, well, I'm not a man, I'm a woman. And this ended up, he filed a bunch of human rights complaints, and the Justice Center acted for these women. And it was amazing how little coverage not just the CBC, but even the National Post, supposedly more freedom-oriented paper, the Yaniv case in British Columbia got next to zero coverage until it was covered in, in Russia and Africa and the United Kingdom and all of these places. And then Canadian media felt embarrassed about not also covering the international story because Canadians were finding out about it from international media. So then they eventually stepped up to the plate and provided some coverage of this fairly significant, I would say, human rights case in British Columbia. And we just got to keep on going. I encourage people, don't bother with the Trudeau funded media, which is not limited to the CBC. It includes the Globe and Mail, the National Post, all of the so-called mainstream media get government funding, and they are, on that basis alone, they're not trustworthy. They're not reliable. We all know the old maxim, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. And so people have to rely on sources such as The Rebel and True North and Counter Signal and LifeSite News and, podcasts like the one that you're doing, Leighton, and so on and so forth. And, just turn off your TV because you're not getting the biggest lies are the lies of omission. I can elaborate on that if we have time, but you're not getting an accurate representation of reality from government-funded media.
Right. Well, so if people want to get more information, you've given us some ideas about where people can get more reliable news, more reliable information. If you were going to point someone to a book or some other source that you think would be a meaningful way that they can further the discussion that we've had today, do you have any sort of reading recommendations? If you were a professor in front of a class and you were going to point the students to a certain book, do you have any suggestions that might help people further their understanding of some of the things that we've been talking about today?
Yes, I would highly recommend a book by Rod Dreher. Dreher is spelled Dreher. I think it's pronounced Dreher. So again, Dreher, Dreher, Rod, and it's called Live Not by Lies. And it is about how freedom emerged triumphant in the East Bloc countries that had been communist for decades. So, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Russia, and so on. Of course, Russia is not a it's not a utopia of rights and freedoms and democracy. I'm not suggesting that, but Live Not by Lies talks about how the dissidents would form their own subculture to connect with each other and to spread the truth, and how they fought courageously, and how they continued to speak truth and live the truth. And ultimately, the truth does set us free. And so it was the courage, the determination, and the perseverance of activists, many of them Christians, but not all of them Christians, you've got it up on the screen, Live Not by Lies. And it says a manual for Christian dissidents. And again, I think any non-Christian would get tremendous value from the book, because the focus is on resisting and triumphing over totalitarianism. So yeah, very enjoyable, very worthwhile, and lots of real life examples, and just a very gripping book.
It is a wonderful book. I actually had the pleasure of reading it recently, and one of the great things about it is that, as you say, it's so practical in its focus, and also it's a highly readable book. It's not written on the level of a PhD thesis, so anybody who is looking for something that is very, very digestible and also very inspiring. I think that's a wonderful suggestion. I have one of my own. It's a bit of an older book. This book is one that you're probably familiar with, John. It's called The Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard. And in that book, he explains how the state is an institution that violates all that we hold as honest and moral, and how it operates under a false cover, which of course we've talked about today. And he shows how the state wrecks freedom, destroys civilization, and threatens all lives, property, and social well-being, all under the veneer of good intentions and securing the public good, which of course we've talked about here, especially in the context of COVID-19. So, John, we've taken a great deal of your time today. I want to thank you so much for being generous with it, and also with your thoughts and your mind and your heart. I want to say a special public thank you to you for being the first person who reached out to me during my cancel culture experience, which not coincidentally happened in the midst of the pandemic. And for introducing me to a whole host of people whom I didn't know about, including yourself, and really changed my life. I had a life-changing experience through my association with you, and through my friendship with you, and because you brought me into the world of the Justice Center, and it changed my career. It revitalized me, and it's given me a great deal of hope and meaning in both my personal and my professional life. So I want to say a public thank you to you for reaching out to me and bringing into the Justice Center family. I'm very proud to be a part of it. And as you know, I'm working very hard to represent the Justice Center well in some high profile cases. But more than that, I just want to thank you for that, and also for taking the time to be with us today. I think you've helped us have a very meaningful and informative, deep discussion about some very complex ideas, but ones that are so vitally important to all Canadians. So thank you very much.
Well, you're very welcome, Leighton. You're too kind. It's a privilege to be on your podcast, and I'm really enjoying the discussion. And there's so much more to discuss. So perhaps another time we can.
Well, we're going to have you back because, I want to have you back, and particularly I want to talk in more detail about some of the research you've been doing on the Weimar Republic and Nazi Germany, and how it has direct implications for Canada. So if you're willing, I'd love to have you back and maybe follow up and have a deeper discussion, a more focused discussion about those things, because to my mind, that's the impending danger that we have to be very aware of. That's coming at us now in the next phase of, let's say, if it's the next phase of totalitarianism. So I do want to have you back. If you're gracious enough to do that, I'd be pleased to have you back again. But I just didn't want to tax you. We've had you here for about 90 minutes, and we don't want to keep you here too long, because you've got a wife and 4 kids to look after, to say nothing of the Justice Center. So, but thanks again for giving us so much of your time today. We're very grateful.
Thank you.
All right.